Okay. Make sure we're doing that before we
Yep, you are good to go.
All right, great. So thank you all, everybody who is joining us for this slightly disembodied meeting of the Anthropology Midwinter Virtual Discussion Group for ANSS ACRL. I am delighted to introduce our speakers today, one of whom you know quite well, Julianne Couture, who is the Interdisciplinary Social Sciences Librarian at the University of Colorado Boulder and is also the ACRL Liaison to the American Anthropological Association. She will be speaking today with Marcel Laflamme, who is Managing Editor of Cultural Anthropology, current PhD candidate in anthropology at Rice University. He also holds an MLS from Simmons College and served as Library Director for a community college in Southeast Kansas. And today we're going to be discussing anthropology libraries and issues of open access and scholarly publication. And we have some slides, but I also think Julianne and Marcel will be asking some questions, and so we'll work with the format as best we can. Julianne, do you have anything you'd like to add to that before I pass it on to you?
Mostly the slides are just our questions.
Okay, great. So we'll sort of do this disembodied conversation and see how that goes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And if you have any issues hearing either myself or Marcel, please just use the chat box to let us know. I think that's probably usually the easiest way to do it. And this is the first time that ANSS has held the Anthropology Librarians Discussion Group online, if I understand correctly. So this is a new thing that we're testing out. The advantage is that it can be recorded and people can listen later. And if you, again, have questions, you can contact us. And I have both of our contact information here. And as Erin mentioned, I am the liaison, the ACRL liaison to the American Anthropological Association, and I've been in this role for about 4 years now, and it's been interesting, rewarding, with a huge learning curve and lots of wonderful opportunities. As part of, in my role, I have gotten more involved with the AAA, and I serve on the AAA's Committee for the Future of Print and Electronic Publishing, which really serves as a sounding board and an advisory board to recommend directions for the publishing program for AAA. And something that I think is really interesting is it's been fascinating to be on the side of a scholarly society, especially as librarians. We talk a lot about how you access information and to some extent how information is produced. But to really be on the side of a scholarly society that's looking at how do we want to make our information available, how do we connect people with our information, what is the role of the scholarly society in general as well as the different sections, really allows for an entirely different perspective that I try to be transparent in sharing with my colleagues who work as anthropology librarians. And so we can talk more about that as we go on if people have questions. But at this point, I'll let Marcel introduce himself as well.
Terrific. Thanks, Julianne. Yeah, thanks everyone here as well for inviting me to join you today. So, you know, the little introduction kind of indicated that, yeah, I sort of served as an academic librarian before returning to graduate school as a PhD candidate. And right, I mean, in my current role with cultural anthropology, I've sort of found myself at the helm of an open access journal. So I mean, the journal is edited by 3 faculty members here at Rice, and then I sort of coordinate the day-to-day production activities of both the journal and our kind of non-peer-reviewed web content. So maybe just kind of by way of chronology and sort of even better than I do, kind of you know, having been having a front row seat. But back in August of 2012, the AAA and Wiley Blackwell agreed to have one journal of the AAA's sort of wider portfolio go open access on kind of a trial basis. There had been sort of interest expressed by association members in the and this was a way, as I understand it, of kind of testing the waters. So AAA sort of put that out to the various sections that publish journals, and the only section that stepped forward to say, yes, this is something that we're ready to take on was the Society for Cultural Anthropology, which publishes Cultural Anthropology, the journal. So there was sort of a transition to figure out what exactly that would look like. I think it was March of 2013 when the announcement was made publicly that CA would go open access. Much of the rest of 2013 was figuring out how to take kind of publishing functions that, Wiley's been at this a long time. They're good at what they do, and trying to figure out how to not necessarily replicate all of those functions, but to just figure out how the SC a true publishing organization, what sorts of partnerships would make that possible, and simultaneously kind of what the journal and the section's continuing relationship would be to the AAA, to Wiley, and to sort of the rest of the AAA portfolio. So I would say, those are sort of ongoing questions for us and for our board, but we are sort of 2 years into this. Our first open access issue was published, so we are now 8 issues into this kind of grand experiment. Our 9th issue, I guess, will come out in a few weeks at the beginning of February. And so, I'm really here to sort of listen. I'm excited to sort of be able to connect with folks who I really having sort of, served as a library director myself, but I guess just by way of the sort of, reflecting on sort of what's happened since our open access transition, and then maybe, in addition to the questions that we kind of pre-circulated, just a broad sense of just really wanting to listen in to you folks about the conversation around open access in your libraries and on your campuses. So, just a little bit of that backstory. So, we, as a journal, we're continuing to draw some royalties from the Wiley contract. I would say in terms of the our analytics are telling us that since going open access, we are sort of accomplishing kind of greater reach in the developing world. It's exciting to see. I would say our reach is actually sort of down slightly in non-US, but sort of traditionally strong. Whoops, okay, I guess I'm cutting out a little bit, so I'll try to get a little closer to the microphone. Right, so I was saying our reach in the developing world has been up since this open access transition, down slightly in countries like the UK and Australia. And so one thing we're thinking about as a publisher is sort of, indexing services. Again, something that a major commercial publisher like Wiley is really good at doing, and we're sort of figuring out how to do that anew and to sort of make those connections for ourselves. Section membership is something that maybe we can talk a little bit more about going forward. That's something that is a source of revenue for us. But I think that there's sort of questions afoot within scholarly societies like the AAA about sort of, what does it do for our members to be members, right? And if once upon a time getting sent a print publication was one benefit of society membership, how does moving towards digital publishing, how does moving toward open access publishing change that calculation as far as sort of what it means to be a member? So I can just leave it at there. And if there are other questions about our sort of evolution to this point, or other questions about our production process, I can always talk about those. But yeah, I would say that my hope here is just to, again, to kind of listen in and in some ways to ask, if open access is sort of a challenge to a sort of received model of putting content behind a paywall and then and then sort of, asking folks to sort of purchase access for it. I think everyone in this ecosystem, whether it's sort of publishers or libraries, is sort of asking, okay, well, what does it look like to remix that? And for us as a journal, I think we're really interested in asking, what are ways that libraries can imagine supporting open access publications like CA? If it's not the subscription out. So yeah, let me sort of kick it back to Julianne, and we'll kind of move on from there.
And Marcel, I will say that last bit you cut out, and I think, were you going to say something other than a subscription model, or?
Yeah, sorry. So
comment.
So I mean, just if the subscription model is a familiar one, but also one that we know sort of in the era of the serials crisis that well, right, to kind of think with the folks here a bit about what are sort of alternatives to that subscription model, and forms of support that we can think of, whether that's money, whether that's in kind. I mean, there's different things that support can mean, but just framing it as broadly as possible, like what are ways that libraries can imagine supporting open access public CA if the subscription model isn't the sort of default one going forward.
Yes, and I'll go on to our first question in just a moment, but just to add on to that, this is a question that I hear come up a lot in the Scholarly Society, but as well as my own conversation with different faculty members, various researchers, other librarians, is feeling like we're at this sort of shift of, we hear a lot about the author fees of, and everyone's like, well, I'm not going to pay $3,000 to have my article printed in an open access publication, but also some libraries supporting that, but also looking at different models, cultural anthropology. I know for anthropology, there's also HOW, and others that are looking. I think PeerJ has an alternative model, but really thinking through what is it that we would like publishing to look like outside of a traditional subscription, or what we have come to understand, or what oftentimes I think are misperceptions as to what open access looks like. You're going to have to pay $3,000 to have your article published. So with that, I thought we'd get into the discussion part of it. The first question that we have was, how would you describe the level of interest in open access, and I have it written here as open access publishing within your library, but it could be thinking about it as open access, people putting articles in repositories and making them available, negotiating their author rights, wanting to see open access be stressed more, but how would you describe the level of interest around open access within your library?
And I guess it should say that we can type questions as well as ask them if people don't have the technology available. I don't know if everyone's headset works. I would say at Georgetown, it's not as strong as you would think it would be. It's something maybe that gets paid lip service to within the library. Certainly we have some folks, who work in scholarly communications, who work in digital services, who are trying to ramp up interest. But for me, at least in the departments I work with, it's not as important as I think librarians seem to think it is. I don't hear a lot of talk about it, I guess. Like people are like, oh, that's nice, and then kind of go about their regular workflow. I've had some non-tenured and junior folks ask me a little bit about it, like what the implications of it would mean, or what can your repository do for me? But all told, I don't think it's as strong as I would have suspected, at least. But that's just been my perspective from this little corner of the world.
Erin, I think you bring up a great point about, people asking, especially early career, about how much would it impact sort of tenure and promotion as well, in asking those questions, and not quite sure where it all fits in.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, people hear the words, but there seems to be a lot of confusion about what it would mean just in your daily life, in your daily workflow. Is there money? Who gets this money? How do we go about doing that? So right now I haven't seen a ton. I would be interested to hear what other people have experiences have been.
Maybe I can jump in too and say that I think that cultural anthropology and actually how are sort of two interesting examples of, so I mean, how being a kind of scratch-built open access journal that sort of into existence, with some really kind of illustrious people behind it. And so, right, I mean, I think that's an example of a journal that has really sort of emerged on the scene and within cultural anthropology of a particular flavor has really established itself as quite a prestigious place to publish, a place that folks are really interested in reading. But I would say, I mean, cultural anthropology is interesting in that as a journal, we've been around for our impact factor is, depending on whether you look at 3 years or 5 years, among the highest in the AAA portfolio. So, that's a model where you have a sort of existing publication that, no question, has sort of career-making potential for folks who are publishing in it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that as we talk about the sort of, what it might mean for untenured or sort of early career folks to publish open access, what sorts of journals we're talking about, and the sort of startup versus the existing model that's been flipped. I think there's it's worth paying attention to the particularities of that too. Miriam, I see, is chiming in here.
Yes, so Miriam says that the situation at University of Oregon is pretty similar, that there are definitely people publishing in OA journals and putting things in the institutional repository, but the primary concern is tenure and publishing in the major journals. And I feel like that's fairly similar here. And I should also note that, so Miriam is at University of Oregon. I am at the University of Colorado Boulder. Previously, I was at Arizona State University. So I've always been at large public universities so that are research focused. And so there's a huge stress on publishing in high impact factor journals for tenure and promotion. And I feel like cultural anthropology is an example of something that is now open access, has that high impact factor, is viewed as one of the best places to publish in that field, but not every discipline has that. And we're seeing more opportunities, but people are also concerned that they'll get docked for it when it's tenure time. I'd also be interested if anyone hears from a smaller institution or a more teaching-focused institution, what some of the conversations are around open access and publishing as well. And I was trying to send a link for how through the chat, but it doesn't want to seem to let me send stuff through the chat.
I can just pick up on Celia's comment as well, just looking at the chat stream. So, some libraries we know, and some institutions are, have allocated funds to support open access publishing, whether it's in the form of sort of subventions for author processing charges from journals. Celia, I'm curious whether that's the case at Berkeley or whether you mentioned monographs or journals that are being put out by campus institutes. So that's an interesting model, whether the subvention is actually, the idea is to sort of support local publishing in a sense. And yeah, I think we're starting to get a clearer sense. I think Spark has a sort of ongoing project to just start to structures that exist at, I think, especially research universities to support OA publishing on the part of researchers. Okay, so Celia's saying, so it includes author processing charges or some copy editing costs covered for locally produced OA. So interesting, yeah, that you know, it could be to sort of send that $3,000, the figure that we're kind of throwing around, but you know, send that money off to a sort of commercial publisher that is doing kind of a hybrid to kind of double down on a local publishing ecology as well. I know we have a question a little bit later about institutional repositories, and so yeah, I mean, different, you know, the different ways that OA publishing or OA, you know, green OA access can happen on campuses, I think is something that we're interested in as well.
And I know here we have like a support for open access, but you know, it is, again, do people know about it? How do they, are they pursuing it? And what sort of questions are there? And then we have a comment here from Amy saying, I'm from a smaller teaching school and our faculty are starting to tackle the idea of publishing in open access journals. We place less emphasis than the larger research libraries on the importance of impact factor in their publishing choices. Yes, and do you provide support for faculty publishing in open access journals?
Okay, so it looks like Amy's saying that, yeah, starting to work on that in the library. I mean, I guess another piece of it too, and as Julianne and I were sort of preparing for this, and we were saying, you know, should we call this open access publishing, or should we, you know, how to frame it? So I think part of it is also, you know, the smaller the institution gets. I mean, I'm quite interested, and I think there's interesting research to be done on where the sort of break happens in subscriptions to, even if we just look at the AAA portfolio, right? So at large institutions, I think having access to the full portfolio through AnthroSource, my impression is that is pretty standard. Whether everyone is sort of equally happy with AnthroSource and various incarnations of AnthroSource is a good question too. But then, you know, there's a point at which institutions are no longer subscribing to AnthroSource, but maybe are sort of doing single subscriptions to American Anthropologist or to AA and, you know, a few other subfield journals, perhaps that faculty have a specific interest in. So I think that's you know, another question. There's the publishing side, and then there's the sort of access to content side. Certainly, when I worked at a community college, I mean, we did not have access to AnthroSource, and so that, I mean, there's that open access question too, just about being able to give students and faculty alike, you know, access to content in the first place, the you know, publishing aside.
And so I feel like this sort of also leads us into our next question a little bit about this funding is, how have your collections decisions shifted, both for anthropology and other areas, due to budget limitations or to support more open publishing systems? I know I am fortunate enough that, okay, well, first of all, we have an anthropology department that really does require us to have a subscription to AnthroSource, and Anthropology Plus. We have Harass. We have a lot of the major anthropology resources. I also have a gift fund that I can use in my discretion. And I have used that in some cases to support, to do a institutional support for HOW. I partnered with our anthropology department to become members of HOW because it's a whole network. And now people could, HOW doesn't charge author fees. Our faculty could publish in that journal regardless. but this was a way to say we're going to support this open system. And we have also in other areas, some of my colleagues in the sciences have done similar things with open access journals that rather than charging author fees, do institutional support. I will also say it's not something that I think is sustainable at this time where we're sort of paying for both open access resources and traditional subscriptions. It's something we're testing, and at certain points we'll probably have to make decisions about which ones we actually support.
Very much so. I mean, I know that's something we've talked about sort of early on, reaching out to departments in particular and saying, you know, if you think there's value to this, you know, can we find a way to, you know, to find support either as members or how sort of has an interesting kind of almost like optional APC policy in place. And I mean, I'm actually curious if anyone here has sort of worked with an author to publish with how, where, I mean, the idea is that if an author has access to APC funds, then they should ask for them, and how we'll sort of, you know, in a sense, will not levy that charge if funds are not. And so, you know, that I think is quite interesting, but whether that would sort of, I don't know, I mean, how that would be received in different libraries, I think that's one of those kind of funny policy questions that I think, you know, where we know we're in sort of new terrain as we're sort of trying to figure out how to structure these agreements. So Priscilla's got a question, and yeah, we'll just read it off and maybe riff on it a little bit. So does open access assume a world that is equitable and fair? And I guess maybe I would ask whether where the question is coming from. I mean, is it that OA assumes that a world that is equitable and fair already, or I guess my understanding of the kind of philosophical underpinnings of it is to sort of say, you know, there is going to be some sort of digital divide. There are going to be sort of, you know, disparate access to resources in different ways, but is OA part of sort of providing access to resources in a more equitable and fair way than already exists? So not to sort of you know, stamp out all inequity everywhere, but to say that, yeah, that this is one way that we can sort of try to minimize that gap between information haves and have.
I think that's an interesting question, particularly as it relates to anthropology, right? Because the AAAs have always had this kind of relationship with, like, the anthropologist and the field site, and like people who are also working but are, you know, in the global south and don't have the certain kind of access to resources. So it's like, in some ways, that model has always been about people who have, right? Those of us in the I don't know, European, American first world, like kind of supporting all of these other people. And I wonder if open access isn't, like, to me, it seems like a sort of similar thing in that institutions that have a lot of money, or authors, or, you know, publications that have a lot of prestige are able to somehow support the rest of the enterprise, or to kind of provide that push for everybody else to be like, oh, yes, like, so, you know, if cultural anthropology goes, like, will other people follow? So, I mean, philosophically, like, I don't have an answer, but I do think that's a kind of interesting way to frame it, particularly with regard to this discipline, right? Like, it has a certain history.
Definitely. And I mean, the other piece I would say is sort of, you know, an interest in kind of, you know, what John and Jean Komaroff have called kind of theory from the South, right? So it's also not just sort of pushing content from the global North and making that sort of more available to, let's say, the developing world. You know, certainly big commercial publishers have programs like Hanari and, you know, I mean, ways of kind of, you know, information philanthropy, right? Sort of pushing content out. But I think OA is also quite interesting in that, you know, you have sort of platforms for journal content produced in the Global South and making that potentially more accessible to folks in Europe or in the United States. Priscilla, yeah, the reference there was to John and Jean Komaroff, their book Theory from the South. I don't know if I can send links either, but that's the title. And CA actually did a kind of author meets critics roundtable on the book maybe a couple years ago. Looks like we have another question.
Oh, yes. Okay, so Amy asked that she'd be interested in hearing how libraries who have funding to use to help pay author fees for OA journals got that funding in their budgets. Is it discretionary money that you've allotted for OA publishing, or did you have to negotiate to get it added? I know here at CU, I think it was part of, before I arrived, there was a decision made that our scholarly resources budget would include a certain amount that was set aside for OA publishing. And authors can apply to get that open access funding. So if they, I think for any one person, they can get up to $2,000 to support their publishing. And I'm not sure, I don't know how much we have set aside. I'm not in charge of that fund, but I think it gets used fairly heavily. I'm not sure if we've ever had to deny anyone.
In the feed before that essentially those funds were, there was a similar setup at Oregon, and either that those funds didn't continue, or was it just that they were sort of, there was a certain amount set aside for a given year, and then, once it was used up, it was used up?
I imagine it wouldn't last terribly long, right? I mean, there's not going to be other projects with the money. Okay, so you only did it for a short amount of time. Whew.
Wow, got it. Okay, yeah. So maybe a 2-year project for $50,000. And I think that's it. I mean, I think that a worry that we have at CA, for example, is that I will say that the author processing charge model is not one that we are especially drawn to as a journal. I think that folks on our board really worry that while the reality is that many of the authors who we publish are at prestigious, that's not universally the case, and I think there's a worry on our part that putting an APC in place sort of sends the message that you sort of, you have to be at an institution that has those kinds of resources to sort of even consider CA. And while, many journals that do charge APCs have sort of waiver programs, I think our worry is that we're sort of scaring people off from submitting and kind of closing off the pipeline. But I also think a worry about APC funds, and I wonder whether other folks on this call sort of share this, is that of cannibalizing the library budget and sort of a pie of an existing size, right? And sort of asking to slice that pie one more way, right? And so, on our previous slide, when we sort of asked about support for open access among senior administrators, I mean, I think that's is the difference between sort of saying, well, look, librarians, if you're interested in supporting open access, fine. But here's the resources that are available. Sort of move the chairs around on the deck as you'd like, versus I guess sort of a broader kind of institutional. Well, okay, we were set up to sort of do subscriptions on one model, and yeah, whether that conversation is sort of percolating up out of libraries, out of the faculty, to sort of the dean and provost level folks who are really driving budgeting decisions in the first place. to feel that way, that in a sense, like an APC fund, whether the library administers it or whether it lives somewhere else in the institution, it's nice, but in a way, does anyone here sort of feel like it's taking resources away from other things? Or you know, Miriam, you mentioned just how money. I mean, is there that sense of it's sort of zero sum in that way?
And also, like, to stay with your metaphor of the pie, like the pie is also getting smaller. Like, it's not like every year the pie is the same size, right? Like, at least for us, certainly here, like the pie is smaller. So if it's taking away resources, it's taking away a bigger portion of proportionately, right, than what it did even 4 or 5 years ago.
And yeah, I mean, I think we have that feeling of how do we support open access while continuing to stay with our current subscriptions. And I think as someone who has that foot also in a scholarly society, the conversation is also happening at the society level of how does a scholarly society move forward? What is the goal of the publishing program? What is its aim, and how is it meant to share the communication of anthropological research in this case? And how's the best way to fund that? Because you have this organization that has many different sections that are producing different journals that have different aims. And should it switch to a different funding stream? What are all of the different ways, and I think Marcel could also talk to this, like what are the different services that a publisher provides that currently cultural anthropology is successful with because it has support from both Rice and Duke, and how would a whole society make that transition? And so how can we also be working with societies to think through how do we want to make our information available, how do we want to have it be sustainable, so that we can continue to publish and make it available to, and kind of going back to that philosophical question, do we want our information behind a paywall or do we want to make it as open and accessible as possible?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, you know, maybe I can say a little bit about our relationship with the Duke libraries in particular. So when the open access transition happened at CA, the editorial office at that time was located at Duke. So 2 Duke faculty members in the anthropology department were editing the journal. So Duke libraries, you know, in addition to sort of you know, serving in an advisory role and you know, just being generally smart folks with good stuff to say, one kind of material form of support provide then, and quite remarkably, I think, has continued to provide even as the editorial office is no longer located at Duke. And I mean, to me, that's a real, you know, investment in the scholarly publishing ecosystem, whether or not there's sort of the, you know, kind of, yeah, the homegrown ROI, I guess. But so, you know, Duke has an open journal systems installation, you know, as part of scholarly communication efforts at Duke. One thing that OJS installation is used for is to publish kind of locally edited Duke. You know, I think some are sort of specialist journals. A couple might even be sort of student edited. But then the relationship that we continue to have with Duke is that we're using OJS, we're using that sort of installation for our submission and review process. So if you go to the Culture Anthropology website, there's a sort of very pretty front end that was, you know, a content management system that was designed for the society and for the journal. But on the back end, the way that authors are submitting manuscripts is through Duke's OJS installation. So I mean, that's you know, certainly a nice example of a kind of, you know, an in-kind form of support. Could we pay for that from a third-party, you know, vendor? Yeah, we could. But I mean, you know, it's it's definitely one way that an academic library is supporting us, even if it's not in the form of a membership or a subscription. Maybe the one, Julianne, going back to your last comment about kind of scholarly societies sort of trying to figure out what the role of their publishing program is. And I think that within AAA, you have these sort of many sections, most of which have their own journals. Not every section of AAA has its own journal, although most do. And I think, I also serve on the board. It does have its own journal, Anthropology of Work Review. But it's a small journal. It's quite a niche journal, they have also just decided to go open access. They've decided not to participate in the AAA's sort of present call for proposals, as they sort of re-up with a new publisher or decide to Anthropology of Work Review.
No, you just cut out on us again. So I missed that last part about that. The Anthropology of Work Review decided not to re-up with AAA?
Correct, yeah. So, sorry that I'm having these microphone issues. Anthropology of Work Review has decided to sort of go their own way as cultural anthropology has, but I think that it's quite a different decision for them because it's sort of not, it is a less visible journal. It may not be one that sort of, there's a huge community of scholars that are sort of clamoring to submit to. It is a niche journal in some ways. And so I think that, I think trying to figure out how, again, going back to, questions about, does publishing open access help my career? Does it sort of set me back? That's one set of answers for sort of big, high visibility journals. But I think for kind of smaller journals, I think it's likely that Anthropology of Work Review will end up reaching out actually to a library publisher. That's something that our board is sort of talking about, and that that might be a solution to sort of look for that kind of in-kind support rather than trying to sort of entirely go it alone. And sort of become a publishing organization in the way that SEA has.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious for our attendees, how many of you have subscriptions to AnthroSource?
Yeah, we do.
So Priscilla says that her institution does not. And Priscilla, sorry, where at what institution are you located? University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. Okay, great.
And then I guess I sort of the next follow-up question would be for those that do have AnthroSource, how would your purchasing decisions shift if, if cultural anthropology is available open access, if, other journals leave that sort of AnthroSource collection, at what point would you shift to saying this is not worthwhile for us to purchase? Or do you feel like because of your departments that you have to subscribe to it no matter what? So it would be if the use went down or faculty said that it was no longer worthwhile.
I imagine at least too some of that decision would be based on the workflow of faculty, like how people get to things. You know, so if people are getting to things through AnthroSource, that interface might remain important even if the content was available elsewhere or open source or something to that nature.
Mm-hmm. So a question that Celia raised is, with moving journals to OA, is how they can be included in Discovery Federated Search for anthropology as a discipline. Right now, there's no one-stop site to search open access articles in anthropology, and I wish I could help AAA create this. Web search won't turn up open access regularly. And I feel like that's an excellent point, Celia, and that so prior to Marcel being in his position, Tim Elfenbein was the managing editor of Cultural Anthropology, and that was something that he stressed a lot, and I'm sure Marcel cares about it just as much, but this idea that, especially when people start open access journals, that the issue of sort of indexing and discoverability aren't at the forefront. Matt Thompson, who has been part of Savage Minds in the past, has also done things of looking at anthropology open access journals and issues with metadata and discoverability and where things are indexed, which I think is another huge point of how do we make sure that if things are transitioning to open access, if journals are shifting, and youth brought up help AAA create this, and you know, if people are creating these under the scope of AAA, how can we make sure that they're continued to be indexed? But things that are created outside of the scope of AAA, where does that responsibility lie to have them indexed and discoverable, or being able to be discoverable through these different searches? Where does that responsibility lie, and how do we connect people to that information?
Yeah, that's so important. So I mean, I'll say two things there. I mean, both cultural anthropology and anthropology of work review intend to continue providing our content to AnthroSource. And so in that sense, I mean, we're, you know, that right, in a sense, we're sort of figuring out how to do this open access stuff, and yet, right, I mean, you know, because our content is still available in AnthroSource, there's not a sort of strong, there's no stick in a way for us to say to researchers or to libraries, well, look, you know, if you want access to this content, you're just going to have to support this open access initiative because that's the only way it'll be available. The assumption has been, and I think it continues to be, that that content will find its way into AnthroSource and additionally be available outside of it on an open access basis. But then to Celia's point, and I'm seeing another comment on the thread there, but it's also, right, like AAA's journal portfolio is also only a subset of anthropological scholarly communication, of course. So, you know, there are, for me as a researcher, there are certainly journals that I'm following, you know, anthropological journals published in the UK or wherever, How is another good example, that are not part of the AAA's portfolio. So I think that's kind of another question that I think, you know, is maybe being brought up here, is that, you know, AAA is invested in the success of its portfolio as a scholarly society, but clearly, you know, as a researcher and for you know, as a librarian, there's this sort of broader universe of I mean, Julian, I don't know if that's something that CEFPAP has talked about in the past, but I mean, to what extent does the AAA have a responsibility for sort of promoting scholarly communication in anthropology even beyond the ambit of its own portfolio?
Well, and I think, you know, there's also again, kind of that philosophical versus practical pull and sort of battle. And really the committee focuses on the AAA portfolio. But at the same time, there has been conversations with other organizations. So things like the archaeologists, I'm blanking on the Archaeology Society.
SAA?
Yes, SAA. But also talking about how are they also sharing some of these concerns, what are different ways that what directions are they moving in, but I think one of the challenges for anthropology is that you have, even as things get a little bit more diverse than the traditional 4 fields, you have people who are working in these different areas of anthropology that are publishing in different areas, that are involved in different anthropological associations. And so sort of if we're thinking about this network of information, where does that responsibility lie in trying to get it all in one place? And is it possible? And I would say at this point, the conversation is primarily around how do we move forward with the future of the AAA publishing portfolio, because that is truly sort of what we have, I shouldn't even say control, but what we have jurisdiction.
Sure.
But while also thinking of what is happening in larger scholarly publishing, what are some of those trends, and what are some of the ways that we want to see anthropological literature go.
Actually, maybe that's a chance to return. I'm just looking back, and Priscilla asked a question a few minutes ago that I think we missed, but she asked, in the opinion of the panelists, has the discipline of anthropology embraced open access more than other fields? So that's a great question. My perspective on that, but I'm curious what others here would say, is that there is a kind of vocal minority within anthropology who identified open access as both kind of pragmatically important to the future of scholarly communication in the discipline, sort of with the serials crisis as its backdrop. But I think, as Julianne said, also a kind of political and right. I mean, a desire to work is able to reach. So I mean, I think those folks have been around. I mean, the Kim and Mike Fortune, who edited CA, I guess sort of now 2 editorial teams ago, were among the kind of early folks to really speak out about that. But I forget who it was who said that, right, there's also a certain degree of kind of like, well, as long as I isn't at the top of my list of priorities. And so my perception within American anthropology, at least, is that you have a vocal minority, but that the rank and file, I would say, is not yet. I think it's newly on their radar. I think folks are interested and curious, but my perception is that the rank and file AAA member, this is not yet up at the top of their list of priorities.
And I would say it's complicated. So there's sort of the philosophical component of, do we want our information to be available? And I think a lot of that also comes back to when you're talking about anthropology, you have this idea of a lot of people who are working with various communities across the globe, where there is the basic understanding that if I don't share this information with them, they probably won't have access to it. And really thinking of how can I make it available to the communities with which I work.
Sure. That
I think makes anthropology unique from other disciplines. Now, that being said, to agree with Marcel, there's definitely this very vocal minority who's saying this is what we should be doing as a discipline. but there's also, I think, a lot of conversations, and again, I think we talk about either something is open access or something isn't, and there's this huge zone of gray between how do I personally share my information and versus what an entire discipline does. The AAA itself, at the very least, since the contract with Wiley, has really been focusing on, at the very least, making their contract green open access. So as far as the standard AAA contract, if you publish with any of the AAA journals, is that you can place your article in an institutional repository, or I believe it's also on your personal website. So those allowances are there, and it is not the publisher PDF, but it is the postprint, so something that has undergone the peer review, which I think a lot of people aren't quite aware of, that they automatically have those author rights available to them. And I see that conversation happening, especially around the whole, when the Elsevier takedown notices came out. That really was, I think, a point where it allowed for a lot of conversation. But as far as other disciplines go, Miriam brings up that there have been fields that are into OA a lot longer, mathematics and sciences. And I think with a lot of these, you have these subgroups who are very much pushing for it, but that you have different areas that are gathering larger conversations. But I think some of it here, at least, comes back to, do you also have people on your tenured faculty who are saying, we recognize the value in publishing in these areas, and we will see that as equal to sort of quote-unquote traditional publications when we're examining your tenure and promotion portfolios. And because I know I hear a lot of it come back to that of, will it be as good?
Right. I think there's a sort of funding model question too. I mean, I think one reason that open access is sort of is the sort of structure of scientific research, right? And is the ability to write an author processing charge, for example, into a grant that would fund a lab group, right? And I think that, some of these questions, I mean, some of you probably know Martin Eves' book about open access in the humanities, and it really makes the case for sort of, needing to sort of take a kind of discipline-specific or at least kind of, domain of knowledge specific approach to open access, right? Because while there are anthropologists who are sort of doing funded research, often, I mean, the scale of that funding, I mean, and was sort of what, friends I have who are in physics spend on a lens for their apparatus or whatever, right? I mean, it's a much smaller kind of small batch scale. And so I think, I think that part of the reason that we're sort of having to ask questions about membership models or about, are author processing charges a good fit for the humanities and the sort of interpretive social sciences, or is that a model that was really invented with the sciences in mind, and that now we're sort of trying to retrofit that model to fit fields like anthropology, but sort of hitting up against institutional structures that make that tough, right? Is it the library that's expected to provide that APC support rather than the NIH sort of routing that through? Julian, do you want to click over to the next slide? I mean, we started to talk a little bit about green OA. And I'm curious, Celia, I think you said that, the UC system does have this kind of institutional depository policy, but, you kind of indicated that faculty don't sort of widely participate in that. My sense is that that's, well, I don't know, is there anyone on the webinar who has an institutional deposit policy and it's just going like gangbusters, like a real culture of green OA deposit?
Not here, no.
Same thing here. Like, we have an institutional repository, but it's and we actually are graduate student organization put forward an OA policy that they adopted and then was sent to our faculty association. But it's, you know, it's something that it encourages people really to do open access, not so much that it's mandated. So Celia, you say that the retrieval of articles is automated and they ignore emails that ask them to click and confirm their publications. Is that to add it to a repository?
What are they clicking on? I want to know how this works.
You know.
While Celia's typing, I know that, okay. Money scholarship, sure. That I think ORCID is maybe, you know, another piece of this increasingly. So, you know, I know Rice is part of a consortium that just sort of entered into an agreement to sort of sync up our system with faculty ORCID identifiers. And, you know, I think various schemes, I'm not sure if that's sort of the, you know, how the UC system is doing it, but I mean, right, to basically populate the depository through faculty information system or, you know, some record that researchers have of sort of, you know, accounting for the, but sort of, you know, designing infrastructures that can go out and sort of grab those articles and deposit it without faculty having to do it themselves.
Does anyone else have a policy around open access and faculty publications?
The question would be, I mean, when you're working with either students or sort of anthropology faculty, I don't know, I mean, how much interest do you see from them in accessing resources through institutional depositories elsewhere? I mean, is that sort of part of their information-seeking behavior? And, you know, is that something that you would sort of, if you're doing a reference consultation with a student, that you would point them, or is it, you know, is it sort of off the radar, you know, for everyone except for the librarians in a way?
I know for me, if it comes up in Google Scholar, then they're like, then that sometimes will lead into a conversation of like, oh, what's that? And then we'll have a discussion of what that is. But I don't know anyone, at least, who in their regular workflow goes to an IR. That may just be indicative of the faculty I work with. They may end up there then, I guess, through also like academia.edu or something. But I don't know anyone who like that would be their discovery part for the most part. But then I'm not at like a very robust IR institution.
I'm gonna weigh in on that. I mean, I think that, yeah, I think this is another area where we could really use, where I think LIS as a discipline could really use to do some research, right? Sort of, you know, yeah, I think that you know, what I'm reading and hearing about IRs is that, you know, once upon a time, the idea was that discoverability was sort of not that great, and you know, how could you sort of compete with the sort of Wileys and the Sages of the world? And, you know, my sense of the kind of shifting conventional wisdom is that, you know, libraries are putting resources behind this and trying to figure out how to sort of surface that content. But it does seem like a missing piece of that puzzle as we understand people. Is sort of, yeah, is that, you know, do folks know to sort of look for content in sort of green OA depositories, or, right, do they end up there even though they haven't sort of set out to sort of access content in that way.
Yeah, I'd say it's, as far as I see it, just from people's, again, this is a place where, usability was great. I would love to stand behind people and see how they end up where they do. But yeah, it's usually through some kind of interface that they already know, and those tend to be the kind of private ones. Like I don't see people doing it through our discovery layer so much. So yeah, I would be interested to hear what other folks have to say about their faculty though.
I know our IR is not really within faculty workflows. It's still fairly new. It still has some bugs, and we're looking at whether or not we want to stay with our current platform. But it seems to me that a majority of the conversation I hear when researchers talk about how they find information, first of all, it's usually through Google Scholar, but also how they share is that they look at academia.edu, and they look at, they ask people for stuff on Twitter.
That sounds right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right. I think that figuring out the extent to which Green OA is sort of a solution to the problem that open access has sort of identified of the sort of disparities in access. It really feels to me like the jury is still out on that, right? And that you have societies like AAA who have continue to publish with a paywalled commercial publisher, but do have this sort of green access that they're allowing. Sort of funder mandates. My sense is, at least in the States, open access mandates from funding agencies dominantly green. Although I think European funding agencies, I see a little bit more movement toward sort of a preferred gold option, or yeah. So I mean, some of that, some of it sort of bubbles up from researcher behavior, and then I think some of it, especially in more centralized systems like the UK, I think trickles down from what the funders and the sort of assessment agencies insist on. Other thoughts on kind of green from anyone here?
Well, then let's go ahead and I think we've actually already talked a bit about this, the mechanism for paying for article processing charges and different mechanisms. But so if everyone's okay, I'm going to move on to the last question that we had, which kind of goes, we were talking about the green open access, but and sort of then the author fees, but really one thing that both Marcel and I are interested in is sort of what are the different models that we can think of. So there are different ones that are being tested, such as the model used by the Open Library of the Humanities, but or what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of membership models for supporting open access publishing? So almost like a subscription, or saying we're going to be members to support this.
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, I think part of what this comes out of is a sense that, I think some of what we've heard at Cultural Anthropology is that, to go to a library and say, we'd really love a donation, to support our, right, like you believe in open access, right? Like it's a good thing. So we'd really love a donation from you to sort of help support our activities. That our sense is like that's a tough sell, right? That there are a lot of, there are a lot of donate to in the world, and that, in the kind of resource constrained environment that academic librarianship is, it's difficult to prioritize something that is structured as a donation, and it's especially difficult to make it recurring, right? I mean, my sense is that that's been a challenge that How has had in some ways, is that, folks being willing to sort of come to the table for the launch of something, but then to sort of continue to offer that level of support kind of year in and year out when other sort of local are going on. It's tough. And so I think, right, I mean, if we think of the kind of subscription model as one thing, you sort of don't pay, you don't get the content. If we think about the donation model as a kind of, well, it's so lovely that this is in the world, and let's sort of support it to the extent that we can. I mean, and as this sort of middle ground of content that is available open access, in a sense, regardless of whether any single library sort of antes up as a member or not, but that, I mean, Open Library of the Humanities has assembled this quite amazing network of I think well over 100 academic libraries at this point who are paying for content that they don't have to pay for, right? The archive, which I think Miriam mentioned, sort of works in a similar way. I mean, library has to pay into archive to allow that platform, to give their researchers access to that platform, and yet libraries do, right? I mean, it's I think a really interesting space as we're sort of trying to understand the different incentives that people have to participate. Does anyone have thoughts on that? I mean, on the sort of, would it be easier to sort of bring a membership to the table, in your budgeting process than it would be a donation?
What kind of a membership do you mean? Like, do you mean like we're members of DLF, we're members of all of these other kinds of things, like as just a single like item, and then we get content along with that? Or as, I mean, a donation from whom? Like the library? Individuals? Those are a little different. The library is not donating anything, I'll put it that way, at least on my end. We don't, we buy things, we do not donate.
Right, that's my sense. Right, I mean, my sense about, I mean, archive, I think, is a model that I've become a little bit familiar with anyway. So, I mean, by way of, libraries sort of sending archive some supporting funds every year. There's sort of recognized, I think there's even sort of local branding, so that if someone accesses the archive from from Georgetown, they sort of see the Georgetown branding on top when they get there. Mm-hmm. So right, but I mean, in a sense, it's not a quid pro quo, because even if Georgetown didn't send the archive a nickel, that content would still be available to researchers there, and I mean, and anywhere.
That seems like it would be an easier sell to me. Just anything that would be recurring like that, and then we could kind of put our name to, as sort of putting good out in the world, right, or supporting some kind of mandate, I think would probably be easier. Of course, it would depend on the amount and how much support we had. Like if faculty said, "Oh, this is an important thing for us to be connected to." But yeah, I could definitely see that certainly working more than the kind of AAA is asking, "Do you want to give money?" or these other kinds of small donation base, and that's, like you said, difficult to sustain. Having an institution pay even a smaller piece of it, like, then you look at other institutions. So if like Georgetown goes, "Oh, well, like Harvard and Yale and Princeton are doing this, like we're more inclined to do it," right? And then if someone looks to us, it's like, "Oh, okay, So to me, that seems a little bit easier of a sell, at least administratively.
That's super useful. Are there other folks who want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, people from state schools might have a different sense. I don't know.
So, I mean, I can say, you know, having been at 2 large state schools, that if you're going to be a member of something as opposed to saying donate it, I guess to me it's along the lines of what are we agreeing to, how are we supporting it, like what is the actual cost, but then also, like anything, if we're supporting one thing, it usually means we have to give up something else. And so if we're going to support something, how do we have the funding for it, and where does it rank in priority?
Miriam, I don't see your comments. Can you write them again?
No, I don't see them either. Okay, so you just joined the Open Library of Humanities and re-upped your participation in Knowledge Unlatched, and that membership is better than a donation. What do you mean by tricky attempts at trying to sponsor documentaries via crowdfunding sites? Like, who's trying to attempt it? Oh, okay. So librarians wanted to use money to sponsor documentaries.
Yeah, I can't imagine they would let you pay for that out of petty cash or whatever.
Right. Oh, and it's the only way to get the DVD. Okay, so that like if you supported through crowdfunding, then you would get the copy of the DVD.
Yeah, this is probably a discussion group for next time, because these sort of these sort of strange things that, you know, like I had one that was it was a book, and it was like, if you pay this amount you get some awesome bonus content, but like you could only pay that through PayPal, and we don't do PayPal. So it's like, yeah, we see that all the time. But crowdfunding is probably not the model forward, I will say.
Right.
That.
But sort of along the same lines, is, you know, we're talking about these different, whether it be a membership model, subscription, donation. But so how have we purchased things in the past? And then how is that different? Sorry, I lost my train of thoughts because I realized that there was a chat and a Q&A. So I just opened the chat component. But, you know, how is it that how we're accessing content is changing, how people are producing content is changing, and how we fund that content in a variety of manners? And how are our processes stuck in how things used to be produced? And how can we change it to support it the way that it is produced now? Okay, so Miriam, you said that Katie put comments in the chat section, and when I opened the chat, I don't see anything, and I don't know if that's because I didn't have my chat open. So Katie, would you mind repeating your comments?
think she may not even be attending anymore. We should probably also think about final thoughts wrapping up since we're kind of, I don't see her on our attendees anymore.
Okay.
Again, this is the first time we've used WebEx, so some snafus are to be expected, I think, but.
Didn't realize there was also a chat and a Q&A.
I can't actually send questions to any of you, which is why I'm talking. It's a weird interface. What are you gonna do?
Yep, we gotta try something, right? So I will just say that I appreciate you all attending, and I know I am very much interested in continuing this conversation, and something that we are, Katie's no longer here, but something that as the liaison to AAA, and I know the ANSS liaison committee is looking at trying to get a blog up and running as part of ANTS Web, where maybe we could have more sort of informal conversations when people can pop in and comment as they can join in. And please feel free to contact me at any time with questions, comments, discussion, et cetera.
I'll just sort of make an invitation too on behalf of CA. I mean, I think that, one reason that I think, something that I have been able to, as someone with experience in libraries, I think I don't know, yeah, to sort of thicken this this circuit of collaboration and to some of you may have seen actually back in October, there was sort of a version of a proposal that was put forward for sort of, turning the AAA's entire portfolio open access. And, the authors of that proposal thing about that proposal that struck me the most is that it made a lot of assumptions about what librarians wanted and what librarians thought and what libraries were likely to do that seemed not terribly grounded in conversations with actual librarians. And so, I think that as someone who sort of, has one foot in the journal camp, but the other sort of as a former practitioner and someone who's really interested in what libraries are saying about these things, the blog's a good example. I mean, if that were to start up on the ANTS side and it were ever useful to sort of cross-post something to the cultural anthropology site and sort of encourage anthropologists to sort of respond, right? I mean, almost start a dialogue that way where, sometimes it's useful for librarians to talk to one another, but I mean, might it be useful for ANTS as a group to say, hey, anthropologists, here's a thing we're wondering about. I would love for CA to be part of the sort of megaphone for that. I mean, if it would be useful for you folks as a section to connect to folks beyond the sort of immediate, faculty constituencies that obviously you're interacting with on your campuses.
It might be useful to, CA has a Twitter account, correct, or no? I can't remember. But,
sorry.
Yeah, no, it's just one of the things I noticed, when I was at the AAA's this year is that I was like, wow, anthropologists really aren't on Twitter to the extent that librarians are. But maybe just even using something like that, if, like I know DLF has like a pedagogy chat or CritLib has a chat, like if there's maybe something that we could do that would be recurring, that would be less high stakes, even just to talk about some of these issues as they arise, perhaps around, conference time or as things come up could be useful, because I do think we have all of these platforms, but they're not interacting with each other. That's something that's a source of frustration to me, certainly. And then, like Julian does great work and reports back to us, and, I talk to people and talk to my faculty, but that's perhaps not enough. So maybe that could be something we could talk about for the future to see how we could put these groups into contact, because I do think you're right. I do think anthropologists were like, oh, librarians want this, and the librarians are like, wait a minute, that wasn't what we signed up for. That wasn't what we were saying, right? So that maybe they have different priorities as well.
Right.
Very much so. Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I love the social media. I mean, we have a sort of lively and engaged social media team at CA who I think would be happy to be a part of that. So yeah, let's have that be one of the kind of follow-ons from this session.
That sounds good. Okay, well, Julianne, Marcel, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for putting up with this slightly strange experience and all the fun technical difficulties it entailed. If you do have any kind of follow-up, please speak to Julianne more about it. I think she's a great intermediary between the groups. Thank you for all of our silent and not so silent attendees. I think that's basically all we've got, unless closing words of wisdom or anything anyone wants to say before we end the recording.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate your participation.
Very much so. Yeah, just look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.